Welcome to episode 52 of the Business Development Podcast. And on today's episode, we have founder and CEO of MBC Group and Claim out of Calgary, Alberta, Canada, Ross Huartt. Stay tuned.
The great Mark Cuban once said, business happens over years and years. Value is measured in the total upside of a business relationship, not by how much you squeezed out in any one deal. And we couldn't agree more. This is the Business Development Podcast, based in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and broadcasting to the world. You'll get expert business development advice, tips and experiences, and you'll hear interviews with business owners, CEOs, and business development reps. You'll get actionable advice on how to grow business. Brought to you by Capital Business Development, capitalbd.ca. Let's do it. Welcome to the Business Development Podcast. And now your expert host, Kelly Kennedy.
Hello, welcome to episode 52 of the Business Development Podcast. And today I have an absolutely amazing expert guest, President and CEO of MBC Group, Ross Huartt. Ross is the President and CEO of MBC Group, a multidisciplinary consulting firm. With almost 20 years of experience, he is recognized for his energy, integrity, and expertise, earning numerous awards and accolades. Ross is passionate about sustainability, innovation, and client-centric solutions. He holds a Bachelor of Science with first-class honors from the University of Northumbria in Newcastle, England, along with PQS, MRICS, and GSC designations. Ross is an active member of professional associations, including the Young Presidents Organization, the Canadian Institute of Quantity Surveyors, and Insurance Professionals of Calgary. He is a captivating speaker and has appeared on podcasts like Uncaged and Knowledge Counts. Based in Calgary, Ross collaborates with experts, often traveling to share his knowledge and provide specialized assistance in emergencies. He is committed to continuous improvement and making a positive impact in his field and beyond. Ross, it's a pleasure to have you. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, thank you for having me. I realize in hindsight that may have been a rather long-winded introduction of mine from the corporate bio. But so I'll remember that for next time.
No, not at all. You know what? I say this all the time. I'm always impressed by the level and caliber of guests that we get on this show. We have such amazing entrepreneurs on this show, and you guys all have such great stories, and I don't mind. Heck, if I mess it up, all of our listeners probably know this already. If I mess it up, I typically go back and fix it because I always love to give people a great introduction because the reality is you've earned it. You guys have worked 20 years to get there. So I will do my best not to screw it up.
No, I joke, I laugh because it's very much it sounds very, very much the corporate version when you hear it back to yourself. It's different when you read it.
Yeah. Oh, totally. But you know what? I don't think anybody is comfortable with their bios. I think it always feels a little bigger and bolder, but the reality is it's not. That's truly who you are. Yeah. It's just us as people like to hide a little bit sometimes. We don't like to be that front facing.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a big difference, when I sort of started the business at 26 or what have you, you have to have the right balance of ego meets confidence, yes. Right? And so, but I've also been very cognizant of not to being too sort of ego driven because it's not necessarily a good look.
No. But on the flip side, like you said, you hit on confidence, and confidence is absolutely critical in business, right? You can't go into any boardroom and pitch a product and do it unconfidently and win.
No. Exactly. And it's interesting because I always say to people, part of my job is sales. Any president's always representing that company, but I don't really sell because it's going to sound corny and cliche. And, whether it's MBC or whether it's EcoClaim, I'm genuinely passionate about those things I've built. And so I think that kind of comes out because I get all excited and then quite often it's infectious. And then before you know, the client's excited or the other side. Yeah. And that's how things tend to go. Of course, sometimes you get people that just aren't excited and you're sat there clutching at straws trying to find something. But
I've been in plenty of both of those meetings. And I'll take the first one any day of the week. So Ross, when we first, first off, my kind of connection to you is we connected on LinkedIn, and I've been following you now kind of probably for about a year, actually, just kind of off and on. And I've absolutely loved your social game. And I know at some point I'm like, you look, I got to get a hold of Ross. I got to get him on the show. I want to have a conversation with him because you're always doing like, you always look like you're having the best time, like seeing what's going on in your world. Like, and I feel like you're so good at it too. You've really nailed kind of like your social media presence and like just a great mix of business and fun and who you are. Like you really showcase who
Yeah.
you are as a person. And I love that about you. But I want to get into that further down the show, and we definitely will, because I think you have an amazing strategy, and I think it emulated by anybody would be a great idea. But I want you to take me back to the beginning, because I know when we first kind of had our first conversation, you were giving me your background, and you came from the UK, and your background was in quantity surveying. And
That's right.
maybe just naive Kelly, but I'm like, what in the world? I've been in construction here for years, and I've never come across that term. Can you maybe take us back
Yeah,
to the beginning of your career and when you got into quantity surveying, maybe educate the public on what it is, and then
of
bring
course.
us to today?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I'll be honest, when I picked my degree choice, as everyone does when I think it was year 18, and you're like, okay, now decide what you want to do for the rest of your life, which is a little bit,
Yeah.
again, I don't think you're in the best position to decide that at
No.
18, but you do. And so very much I was looking at professions. It was 2000 and when was it? 2005 or 6 it was when I was looking, and the construction was booming. And I'd always had a bit of a travel bug. My sister had moved to the US sort of 5 years before this point. And it wasn't because she moved, but we'd always traveled and I just wanted to go see the
Yeah.
world. And so I was looking at professions that potentially aligned with that didn't require, if you become an engineer, for example, you have to then get all the engineering bodies and affiliates are all country specific, state specific. And so freedom of movement is not as easy, shall we
Yeah.
say. Whereas there's an institution called the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, been around since 1600-ish, around there.
Wow.
So a long-standing institution by
Yeah.
Parliament in the UK. But the real reason is I was looking through courses, and I wanted to stay relatively close to home at this point because I knew I just wanted to head out into the world once I was done. And Northumbria offered a bachelor's in quantity surveying, and I had no idea what that was either, to be honest with you, when I was
Yeah.
18. And so I did some research, and it turned out there was a lot of companies. It was in high demand, and so there's a lot of companies offering to sponsor university. So, and don't get me wrong, in the UK, I was the first year it was free. Before, if I was a year older, it would have been
Yeah.
free. But the UK changed that, and pay somewhat. So I applied to it, and then in conjunction with that, I did get accepted, and then I applied to a few sponsored student programs. And the idea behind that is they provide you like a bit of an allowance. They essentially pay for your university, and the expectation is you come work for them for a minimum period of time after university.
Okay.
And so I think it's a good way to capture talent, and also a great way to get work experience while you're at university, which is what I
Yeah.
did. So that was primarily the reason behind it, to be honest, was travel. And I had no idea how much of a complex profession it was and how widespread it is. I mean, outside of North America, it's part of construction. Clients have quantity surveyors, contractors do, subcontractors do, and it really is the commercial management of construction from both direct site, but also legalities of procurement and all that exciting
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
And so, I went to University of Northumbria to do that, which was it's a 4-year degree. One of those was work experience. And it's a good point to note because actually I've never even thought of this connection until right now. But hindsight's wonderful, because when you look back over the course of your life and your career, if this didn't happen, you don't think they're related.
Yeah.
But when you work it back, and so in 2008, I think it was, I went to work for Vinci, who was
Yep.
the company that sponsored me. And I went to work for them for a sort of a gap year, if you will, called a year in industry. And they were constructing, well, actually it was Taylor Woodrow at the time who got acquired by Vinci, but they were building Wiston Hospital in the UK. So they were demolishing a Victorian hospital that was a few hundred years old and essentially constructing one of the largest new hospitals in the UK at the time. So I think like a 10-year project or from start to finish.
Wow.
So I was placed on site there, part of the commercial management team. And, you know, as with it, that's what I tell everyone as well. People think, you know, everyone does the crappy jobs when you first start, right? Because that's how you learn, right? And so a lot of times now there's like some people feel it's, I don't know, beneath them, if you will. But, you know, when you go there, you're essentially a glorified admin because you're at the bottom of the totem pole. But what I decided to do was use that as a learning opportunity, right? And just soak up as much as you could. Incidentally, it was also where I met my boss at the time, who was the lead quantity surveyor. We got on very well. And he ultimately, while I was there, moved to New Zealand. Not for any, just wanted to move across the world, got a visa. And so he left towards the end of my year there. Then I went back to university. Of course, in 2000, towards the end of 2008, you can appreciate, if everyone remembers, that financial crisis. And so as with in construction is very, very much directly tied to the economy. And so my choice of quantity surveying wasn't looking too hot come the last year of university, because by 2009, the recession had sort of was starting to really take a hold. And so I was sat there being like, and then of course in 2009, the Vinci then cancelled all their sponsored students, basically said, you don't have to give us anything back, but we're not taking anyone on. Which again, you can understand they didn't have any work. Sure. So I started then looking for, I guess, initially jobs in the UK, because again, you're never going to be able to leave and go abroad with no experience first. And so I was lucky enough to get, what a big set. It was like 1,000 people showed up, and it was essentially a graduate program with like 30 spots. And for Barratt Developments, they were the UK's largest house builder. And so I actually got on their graduate program, and it was quite unique because the first year you would spend 3 months in each of their departments. So you'd spend 3 months in your QSing, 3 months in sales, 3 months in finance, 3 months in land. So you got exposure to all their business units, which you would never normally do. And then in the last year, you picked one and went into it. And so that was really interesting. And I think that's really where I got my really early understanding of what makes a business run. It wasn't just like, as a quantity surveyor, you're doing one small piece of the overall organization. However critical it may be, there's still a lot of other facets. And so getting exposed to that was, I guess, sparked my interest in all of it. And I didn't really know I was an entrepreneur because, again, I didn't have any exposure to what that was back then. I mean, I think it's a bit different now with social media. Sure. And so as I got accepted to that, got through the first year, and I mentioned things tying together. Well, out the blue, not out the blue, but you'll remember in 2010, the Christchurch earthquake happened. And so if you remember, my previous boss at Vinci had moved out there. So he actually took the opportunity to start his own firm and provide consulting on damaged infrastructure properties as a result of the earthquake. And so he called me because I guess he knew sort of what I was like, or even though I was sort of relatively inexperienced still. And so, I got what's it called? I think it's IEC, International Experience. That one's Canada. So anyway, if you're under 35, you can essentially get two visas if in Canada or Australia to go work there for a year or two. And so I did that for New Zealand. It took a couple of months, and then decided to go to New Zealand, Christchurch. And if you drill through the earth, you literally could not get somewhere further away from where I was born. And so it kind of worked out well, I guess. I wanted to move. And so packed up, went over there. I'd never even been that side of the world, never been to Australia. So I knew the Queen was on the money, so I thought probably feel all right.
They spoke English. That was critical.
Well, that's it. Yeah, they spoke English. The Queen was there. There's some kind of connection, so I'm sure it'll be all right. And I went out there, and when I first landed, which was like a 42-hour journey, right? It's a good amount of time. And I'd never seen an earthquake-stricken city before. and
Most
it
haven't.
was quite like. But I still remember. But I can still. It was like it's weird. If you've ever been to Universal Studios, and that ride where the water comes rushing in the subway. I think everyone knows that if you've ever been. And it just really felt like a movie set because a lot of the buildings and areas were cordoned off still for
Yeah,
safety. But you could look through the fences and you could see like coffees and sandwiches in the coffee shop still. And so it was a bit, yeah, it
yeah,
just was very apocalypse-esque, it felt like.
wow. Like, what was that like? Because that would have been a fairly new experience. Like, obviously, you've just come literally around the world, so you're still dealing with, the shock of that, and then you end up in a place
Yeah,
that the infrastructure is a mess. You know?
yeah, I've never looked at it like that because for me, it was always like, it always seemed like an
Yeah,
adventure. I mean, and I only got diagnosed a couple of years ago, but so I have ADHD, which explains a lot of my behavior from childhood to 3 years
it just
ago.
makes you like,
And so I believe one of the traits of ADHD is sort of your risk compass, for lack of a better term, doesn't work quite the same as
yeah.
others. So I was like, oh, we'll go to New Zealand on an adventure. It just never occurred to me that it was like I never thought of it like
Yeah.
that, if that makes
Yeah, yeah,
sense.
yeah. No, because like, you think about it, and I feel like that trip on its own on a regular day would have been challenging for most people. Even though it's
Oh,
English speaking, it's a completely different country. You're literally going there to live. Like it's not like you're on vacation,
no one.
right? And then on top of that, you get there and it's the infrastructure is a mess. You're having to deal with a natural disaster, an incredibly bad one. I feel like,
Yeah.
that would have been incredibly hard for most people. Like, what were you feeling at that time?
Yeah, as I said, it's quite a somber feeling, but it also, again, having worked in lots of catastrophes since, due to the nature of the work we
Yeah,
do, the resilience of people and communities never ceases to amaze you. So we talk about it being a catastrophic event, which it was, and there was some loss of life in the second earthquake, which was tragic and could have been avoided. But all in all, on the backdrop of the significance and size of it, I think the casualties were fairly limited. Not that any casualties are acceptable rather. But again, the resilience of the people. Within months, they'd set up a new downtown using shipping containers for stores. And like you can tell, it's important for communities to have their centralized
yeah,
spots, the center of towns. And so I think they did as much as they could to sort of bring some normality back. Now, I always say this to people, and, because we're in the insurance world, it is a tragic catastrophe that you'd not want to go through, anyone to go through, losing their home, their business, loved ones, anything like that. But when it's all said and done, Mother Nature did it, we didn't do
yeah,
it. And so at the end of the day, I'm a glass half full type of guy. I think you have to be as well as an
sure.
entrepreneur.
Yeah,
Um, the city had New Zealand was in an economic boom. I don't know if it still is because I haven't checked on on geopolitics in a while, but for a long time it was. And the reason for that is you had around a city of about 500,000 people, not very big, like half the size of
hmm,
Calgary, had around 40 to 60 billion dollars pumped into it from insurance companies, the government. And so the economic injection and benefit to the city was
yeah,
massive,
absolutely. Wow, that's a lot considering the size.
right? And so, I mean, I don't know the GDP of New Zealand, but I'm hedging my bets it's not that, or maybe not
Probably not.
quite.
Yeah, wow.
And to me, I think that was the main takeaway, was people's resilience coming together and experiencing that. And also, to be honest with you, it's where I kind of had my first go at entrepreneurship, and it didn't work. So, but we all have. Whilst I was working with the gentleman that had brought me over, some of my family have a business in the UK, and they essentially train people to do trades. So in the UK, plastering's a big thing because they plaster houses
Okay.
still, right? Tiling is painting. They're all in demand
Yeah.
trades. And so they essentially have a bit of a trade school. Government funded it. And so I tried the same concept. I was like, this is a earthquake damaged city. There's lots of trade. Surely this would work. And so we kind of got it off the ground, had some classes go through, but it just wasn't, again, I would say the little knowledge I had about
Mhm.
business, I kind of cringe looking
Yeah,
back, but you have to try
sure.
somewhere.
Yeah, you learn somewhere.
Yeah, and so it wasn't a super expensive endeavor, but it didn't work, but it didn't deter me per
Yeah.
se. And then I think about a year and a bit into it, the gentleman that brought me over decided we had about 5 people at the time, and he just hated it.
Mm-hmm.
He realized he didn't want other people to have to rely on him. So he basically said that he's gonna move to the north, take his selected clients, and just do the work himself, and just didn't want to have to.
To manage a team.
Yeah. And so I was like, all right, well, I'm out in New Zealand here, so I was like, but luckily, my skill set and profession was in high demand still, so it wasn't really tough to get another job. So at that time, I'd got another job, but this was like a year and a half into it, and I was sort of a city of half a million people in the middle of nowhere. I never saw myself staying in New Zealand forever.
Yeah.
And with having a sister in North America, a couple of friends in North America, I'd sort of always wanted to move out this way and started sort of looking at opportunities. Now, I guess sharing something personal, not everyone knows, but I think in 2013, about 3 weeks before I was due to travel to Canada, and I was very fit by then. I was doing CrossFit, I was running.
Yeah.
I actually had a stroke.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I had a mini stroke, and I remember going to the hospital, getting my roommate to take me to the hospital because I was like Googling what was wrong, and it was like stroke.
Yeah.
So that was a weird feeling. And they did all these tests and essentially said, sometimes some plaque can break off and cause an issue, but there was never anything identified. And touch wood, everything's been good since. But that was it. Now talk about scary. Now that's probably the only time I've been scared, I would say, because when you're 10,000 miles away from your family and you're in hospital, and you're supposed to be taking a flight in a few weeks, and you can't, my ability to text, for example, and find words had gone.
Wow.
It comes back. But it's a weird experience. I remember being stood in a Subway trying to order a sandwich, and I'm looking at these onions, and I just cannot find the word. I'm trying to say it, and it's just not coming out.
So you're aware, you're very aware that you can't find the word.
100%. You're you kind of know what it's so weird. You know what it is, but your brain's just not telling you. So
wow.
But luckily, everything sort of was fine, and me being me, I think I was back working out in a couple of weeks, and then packed up my bags and headed to Canada. Incidentally, I had a job offer. I didn't have a visa because they had a pilot scheme in Alberta in 2013. So if you're a construction estimator, which essentially that's a function of quantity surveying, you could get a pilot visa to come in because it was in demand. Of course, it was never going to be that easy. So I showed up to Calgary Airport with my suitcases, and I was dreading this because I don't know if you've dealt with immigration consultants. It just depends on the person and personality type you get, not facts. And I got in line, and I'm standing in line, and I can see all the immigration officers, and I'm like, there was one that looked like Scully not Scully, the librarian on Monsters Inc.
Yeah.
Right, that's what she looked like, and I was standing there going, please not her. And obviously that was the one I got. And it was a good start because she'd never heard of this visa I was talking about. So I was so I had to show her all the information for that. And then she notionally decided that I didn't have a piece of paper from the Canadian Institute of Quantity Surveyors to certify what I was. You don't really need that, but you can't argue with them.
Fair. Yeah.
And so she actually gave me 5 days to get it. And I was like, well, being British, you usually have about 90 days. Yeah. But she was like, not today, you're not. I was like, okay, fair enough. And then, so I got that piece of paper, drove down to Lethbridge, do the crossing. Went around the flagpole, got an immigration officer, super friendly, didn't even look at the piece of paper that I had, and said, yeah, you're good, there you go. And I was in Canada. That was how I arrived. A bit of a land and tumble, but I got here.
Yeah, you went around the flagpole.
And funnily enough, not that I would come to know this later, but I pretty much met my wife to be like day one. I mean, we weren't going to get, we weren't, we weren't going to date for 3 years following. But it was interesting that almost day one I met my wife.
Wow. Where?
So she worked at a diner called Red's here in Calgary,
Okay.
and downtown, and I'd moved in around the corner, just in an apartment, and that was the local breakfast hangout. So
Cool.
it was, and then worked for a company providing quantity surveying services. Here, it's really just the QS is more of a, it's more project advisory.
Okay.
So advising on costs, bringing up budgets, certifying payments and progress, those sort of things.
Yeah.
So I worked for, but honestly, that was not where my passion lies, is doing estimates. Like, I've always been able to do them, of course, but just wasn't for me sitting behind a computer 8-10 hours a day.
That's fair.
But I then luckily got headhunted by a consulting firm in the insurance industry here, based on the fact that I'd spent the last 2 years assessing earthquake damages. So again, that what I didn't realize going out in New Zealand would be that just that entire 2-year period was really laying the foundations for what was about to become MBC.
Yes.
And again, and you just don't fathom it, because I don't know, you're not able to see those dots yet.
Yeah.
And so I was headhunted, went to work for that company, worked there for about 1.5 years, absolutely loved the job. For me, I think it's a little bit of the ADHD again, but in standard construction, you often get put on a project for a long time.
Yeah.
Like the hospital, 10-year period. So those QSs on that hospital for 10 years. That's a good part of your life.
Yes.
Right. And so with insurance, what would happen is you'd get an assignment every like a couple of weeks, just their help, but it would be totally different. So like someone's supermarket could have had a fire and they need to get back up in business, and you're supporting it. Someone's home's tragically had a loss, and you're going to get there and let them know how it's going to get reinstated and the timeline is. So you're there to advise the insurance company on the facts, but you're also there to alleviate the insured and let them know that there's actually going to be an end in sight to this.
Yeah.
And so what I loved about it was just that it was very, very client facing in a time of need, which often brings its either positive or negative emotional connotations, which can make projects interesting. And so that client service side of it, I always loved, and the variety of the work I always loved. And so I found my sweet spot, I thought.
Well, what like you said, you didn't get stuck in a same project for 10 years. You get a very well-rounded exposure. Right?
Yeah, because we've worked on hospitals, pipelines, schools, and it's all tied to insurance, but it's those projects nonetheless.
That's right. I've always found that very valuable in my career too, is that I've had a very wide range of companies that I've worked with in a lot of different industries. So same thing, you learn something new at each and every one of them, and you don't get that experience unless you take on those extra clients. And unfortunately, if you get stuck somewhere for 10 years, you might be really great at that one thing, but it's just that one thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, there's nothing wrong with specializing. It just really depends what you want to do. And for me, it was all construction, so it was all nuts and bolts. Really, when you boil it down, sure, it's more complex, less complex, different building strategies, code. But at the end of the day, it's putting components together, right? And so that's what quantity surveyors do: quantify construction.
Yeah. It's so weird that because you explained to me the various aspects of it, but it's like here, all of those aspects are an individual job.
Correct. Yeah, it's weird. In the UK, essentially you have two groups on site: the construction managers, which would be your project managers, then your commercial team, which is the quantity surveyors. The construction manager's job is to get it constructed to the schedule ASAP. It often a total disregard for finance. The QS's job is to make sure that is held accountable.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So you can see why it works, because one wants to get it done, but one wants to be like, yes, but within these means, and it's your job to work that out. So rather than prevent overruns, not that it does prevent it, of course, but good QSing can help a construction project do very well.
It's an all-encompassing management.
Yeah, I would say, yeah. I tell people it really is the commercial management of construction. So that includes everything from the contracts all the way through to overseeing the budget during construction, final accounting and wrap up. Like they have a big role to play. Now in Canada, quantity surveyors have been pigeonholed a little bit, it seems, primarily as sort of providing services to banks to monitor
Okay.
loans, to protect banks' interests, which again is fine. But to me, it's just it seems a very small part of what they can do.
Yes. Yes.
But Canada, whilst it has lots of British influence, equally has lots of US
Yeah.
influence. And I think construction here more deeply represents the US model than it does the sort of UK model.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree with that, except for the Parliament.
Yeah, except for Parliaments, they still wear their wigs and
Right.
all the rest of it.
That's right. We still shout nonsense at each other across the way.
Yeah, it's still the King's Bench as well, right? So.
Okay, so tell me. Okay, so you got into that insurance aspect of it. Now take us into to MBC Group. How did that happen?
Yeah, that's where the fun starts, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I don't mind being open about this. So, long story short, I was within a year at this company. I was sort of the highest biller, like the top producer. I had a client following. I loved what I was doing. I had a lot of the team in the office working with me, like on my things, because again, that's where I learned relationships, business development. Like I didn't call it that; I just did it, and it's like a natural thing. And so, but I got to a point, and it honestly all started with wanting to get a mortgage, I'll be honest. So the job had a commission element to it, so on your billable hours. So I was paid fairly well. But of course, after such a killer first year, and I wanted to get a mortgage, and turns out at the time companies didn't really care about your commission unless you had it for, I think it was like a 2-3 year period. And so my base salary didn't look great. And so I went to the company and said, here's what again, Mr. Prepared. I don't just go in, because too many people go in and say, oh, well, I want more money because I've done well. But like, you got to come with some metrics, right? And so I put all those metrics together, demonstrate. I even like guessed how profitable I'd be based on what I knew. And I said, I just asked, I wanted $10,000 more. And they came back and they basically said yes, but then it was kind of like taking it from here.
Yeah.
So like lowering your commission, and I'm like, well, that doesn't, like, I just had the best year of anyone.
Yeah.
And anyway, so that kind of like, but I was like, you know what? Fine. Okay. So I then went back and said, well, at the time they'd started this new division that was handling sort of complex work. And I essentially offered, I said, if you make me associate director, like you're number 2, with no pay increase, I'll show you what I can do. Like I'll earn that over the year because I loved the job. And they came back and just said no. And I said, okay, well, fair enough. So, but at this point I'd been approached by lots of competitors and what have you. And I hadn't really bothered looking, but I'm like, okay, well, and then I talked to several of them, some big companies. And to be honest, the offers it was sort of a sideways move.
Yeah.
I was like, well, it doesn't really make sense to me. And so I was looking at my options. And I thought, well, why not just do it myself? I was like, I think I can. So I made the decision and I started a company at the time called Pace.
Okay.
Obviously representing speed, if you will. But it actually was an acronym, but for some reason that acronym completely is gone from my brain right now. Because it was obviously that memorable.
A while ago, yeah.
Yeah. And so I was going to tell my boss at the time because we'd work closely together. And I know I told someone who I thought was a trusted client, like close to me, and I'd only told the one person. And so then I remember getting a call from my boss at the time. He'd be like, oh, we've heard this. And I was like, well, I won't say his name. I nearly did. I said, well, I wanted to talk to you in person. I said, I didn't want to tell you over the phone when you're in Toronto, but this is. And then he actually was really angry, told me I was short-sighted and sort of hung up. I got disconnected from the company stuff and then left in fire and brimstone. I distinctly remember, bear in mind, I was just a consultant in Calgary. I distinctly remember them sending an email out across the entire company that I'd left and I was not to be talked to. Wow. And so I was like, I couldn't get a raise. I couldn't get a promotion to earn the raise, but you're worried that I'm going to do something. So like, if you're worried, surely would you not have? So I've
You
always
think
made sure
so.
in business to like keep an eye on
Yeah,
that.
totally.
Right.
It's frankly just being aware of the big picture, right? And
Right.
yeah, it seems very true.
And some of our best leaders are our young ones. Like I say young because I'm only 35, they're 30, so youngins,
Yeah,
but take it with a pinch of
yeah,
salt. But and don't get us wrong, it hasn't always worked, but a lot of times when you believe in people and you give them the tools, and they've got a, I hate to say it, but you do have to have a bit of killer instinct.
yeah,
If you don't, you can't take that leap at that age.
yeah. Me,
Right? Because people need to know you're serious, and sometimes under 30, you're not necessarily taken as seriously as you could
totally.
be,
Yeah. Me and
right?
you are the same
But
age. I'm
you
34,
got to
just
believe
about
in.
35.
There you
But
go. There you
I
go.
got into business development when I was 23. And as you can
Right.
imagine,
Okay.
being the young punk at 23, at the
Yeah.
time I don't know, that would have been around 2012. And,
Yeah.
you're going into meetings with 65-year-olds, executives and trying to convince them that the firm you're working for is a great firm that you should check out. And they're looking at you,
Yeah. And you
this
know what you're
punk
talking
ass
about.
kid, what does he know? Right. So I totally, I totally get that. You had to learn it. For me, I had to develop it young because I was young. I was just given a
Yeah.
good position young and I had to figure it out.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And again, I like to think I'm good at public speaking. I enjoy giving seminars, presentations because I get very animated and into it, and it feels
Totally.
natural. But it didn't just like, whilst I'd always had that confidence piece, I remember when I first started the business, and there was no strategy behind it. It was I needed to get in front of anyone that could give me work,
Yeah.
like any client demographic, and that's all I did. It wasn't strategic. A lot of it was a waste of time, but a lot of that brute force
Yeah.
worked. And I remember giving seminars to like rooms of people and being like really nervous.
Totally.
Like I would get like for some reason, and it happens sometimes. It's not due to nerves, but my face just gets red or
Yeah.
flushed, and it's not because I'm nervous. I think it's just a adrenaline
Well,
response.
I talk about this a lot because, like, even though, like, talking to me, I probably seem very extroverted, but I was a very introverted person. I
Right?
became extroverted in business development when that became my role, but it was a learned skill. I did not start this way. I was not always extroverted. And so I still
Yeah.
struggle with, performance anxiety on occasion, right? Especially with speeches or like big pitches or stuff like that. There's still moments where even for me, I've done thousands of them. I still have that moment. And I think, what I mean, I would venture to say there's a lot of introverted people that have become extroverted in
For
order to
sure.
accommodate the role that they have ended up in. But it's funny. It's so funny. I was talking to you earlier, right before this. My this week's guest is actually an organizational psychologist, and
Yeah.
so we were literally just talking about this and how there's a lot of introverted people that are in extroverted positions. It's a very common thing these days, and
I always thought I was an extrovert, and but I'm not. Like it's not that I'll give an example. An extrovert. This is how it works for me. An extrovert gets energy from being extroverted and with
mhm,
others. I don't. Like I start with lots of
yes,
energy,
yeah,
ADHD, and then it goes like this. And that's why I'm typically don't unless I'm on the road, you'll not usually ever catch me at anything evening related in
yep.
Calgary.
Yep, I would say
And
I think that that's normal, Ross. I think that by the time you get to the higher level executives in most companies, I bet you that that is the case for, I would say, 80% of them at least.
yeah, absolutely. The biggest change for me, and I mean, we're not like a $1 billion company or anything. I think we've got about 130 people, but it is kind of interesting because you still feel like the guy that started it in his basement a little
Yeah,
bit. And not imposter syndrome because again, I deal with lots of C-suites of multi-billion-dollar companies, and some of them I would class as friends now. But it's interesting because I remember meeting the CEO of Barrett Developments, for example, and you're like, whoa, it's the
yeah,
CEO, and you've got this. It's like, and then I'm not saying that I don't ever feel like that, but then sometimes when I meet team members I've never met
yeah,
before, you can almost sense that like
yes,
that in,
yeah,
not intimidation, but like I'm trying to break that down because I'm just
yeah,
Ross, and I get it's kind of a respect thing as
mhm,
well. But you don't want people to be you're just cognizant of like you can see that. I remember talking to one of our team members in Vancouver maybe last year, and I felt like he was petrified,
mm,
and I was like, And the nicer and calmer I was, the more scared he looked until I was like, I'm going to leave you now.
Yeah, there becomes this like by the time, yeah, I totally understand that because as a kid, I used to feel that way too, when my
Right.
bosses would come around. But it's like now I've met, I mean, I've worked under enough CEOs that I realize we're
Of
all
course.
people, right? Like we're all
Yeah,
just people.
yeah, that's it.
But
Yeah,
it takes a while, I think. And I think if you haven't had that exposure multiple times, yeah, I can totally understand that.
yeah. And it's just interesting to see that happen in your own
Yeah,
organization.
yeah, yeah. No, and it's
And
sorry, go ahead.
no, go
Oh,
ahead.
and I was gonna say, like, you're quite young too. So I think there's a bit of an approachability there that maybe you don't get if you were older. Like, I think maybe you might do a little better because you're a little younger.
Yeah, yeah, hopefully. I mean, that's part, like, when you talk about the LinkedIn strategy piece, there was as I mentioned, it wasn't really a
Yeah,
strategy. It just started 5 years ago, and I just started sharing things I was
yeah,
doing, and then it's really been the last. And but it's the power of it, man. Like, we made an announcement last week, and I've had 6 new customers see the announcement and want to be involved in this eco-claim program.
yes,
And even, I have customers reaching out to me to, mention, Ross, is it okay if I tag you in LinkedIn? I just want to share something, da 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 da. But like, people I meet and networks are now starting to do the LinkedIn thing, but a lot of it's because they've seen
yeah.
mine. Now, I love it. I don't think it's copying whatsoever.
Yeah.
I think more people should share your story, share your journey. That's what it's about.
Yeah, and I think in 2023 it's becoming expected, right? Like it's not enough to just be an organization in 2023 and be behind the scenes. People want to know the leaders of an organization. They want to see the executive group. They want to, and I think that you've done an amazing job of that. And I know I'm not just blowing smoke up your butt. The reality is I've been following you myself for like at least a year at this point. And yeah, like
Yeah.
I love your posts. Your posts are always engaging. Like it's a great mix of business and who is Ross, right? And I love
Yeah.
that aspect of it. And I think you do a great job. And I think as we go forward, in 2024, 2025, organizations are going to have to shift a little bit. There's going to, this is a conversation I've had with many of my executive guests talking about the importance of socials, the importance of some type of forward face. Like when I started this podcast, I didn't really know what was going to come of it. The reality is it's become a great podcast around the world. And, we're actually the only business development focused podcast in Canada at this time, which is still
Yeah.
blows my mind. I had no idea when
Right.
I started it that was the case. And yeah, you could say, well, poor market research or whatever. But like, I was doing this for me initially just to try it and see if I could do it because introverted Kelly needed to figure out how to have some type of outward face. How can I share my knowledge with the world? How can I help other companies grow, but also showcase my expertise? This was the way. And but I
Absolutely.
had to learn it. And I mean, in the beginning, it always felt like I was just talking to the wall for the longest time, but it has become my platform. But I think that you have done a great job on LinkedIn and showing people who Ross is. And I think if you were to keep that up, you could branch that off into a podcast of your own or into YouTube of your own. I think you're really that type of person.
Yeah, it's one of those, like, I would argue I've never really used social media that much, like on the Instagram, Facebook, sure, I'm on it, but it's never
Yeah.
been like a thing. And so the LinkedIn was a little bit different for me because it felt more attached to the
Yes.
business. But it really, honestly, like, there's no, and I told you this when we chatted before the show, that I've still got all the podcast equipment in boxes in my office from
Yeah.
February because I fully planned on getting it set up.
Totally.
But just with how the last 2 quarters have gone and how busy we've been with lots of corporate initiatives, new
Yes.
businesses, and I just haven't had
Yeah.
time. But now what I'm trying to do is sort of pull myself a little bit more out operationally so I can work on the bigger picture vision, but then also fit things in such as a podcast. So whilst it might seem, and I think this is where the clash comes a bit. If you're an older executive, you don't necessarily, doing a podcast seems like a weird thing to
Yeah.
do. But you've just said it yourself. Whilst you want interesting guests on, you want an audience, it becomes your platform to share what you
That's
know
right.
and what type of person
Yeah.
you are. Right? People, like, I think after our first call, I was like, "Oh, how do we work together?" Because you just know when you get along with someone.
Yes, yes. Like, and it really is like you get to see who they are, right? Like, I feel like
Like,
from our conversations and from this podcast, I feel like I have a really good idea of who Ross Huartt is. And I'm
Right.
sure you feel the same way about who Kelly Kennedy is. And that's the same connection you get with every one of your listeners. And you get it
Yes.
because it's such a personal form, right? Like voice is such a personal form of interaction. I like,
Yes.
I feel like my favorite podcast, and I have plenty of them that I love. I feel connected to those people. Like if something happened to them, I would genuinely feel bad about it because
Yeah.
I love their shows. I look forward to it every week. And it's I don't know them. I have no personal connection to them, but that's the level of connection you build with any type
Yeah.
of interaction like this.
What I love about podcasts, honestly, when you really look at it, is it became radio for
Yes.
everyone. Right? It's brilliant. So radios, it was an archaic form, and who listens to radio when TV
Yeah.
exists? But literally, we've come full
Yes.
circle. People want to listen to other
Well,
people.
and I think for executives too, the reason a podcast is so compelling is that, we're on the road all the time, we're traveling, we're doing, whether we're doing reports or tedious work, and it's something that we can listen to. And so the reason that I opted, people ask me, Kelly, why don't you have video? Like, why don't you have video on this? Well, because my listeners are high level executives or entrepreneurs, and they're probably listening to me on a car ride to work or on a plane or
Yeah.
entering data on their computer. They're not looking at me. They're listening to me.
Yes. That's a good observation. You're right. Because I was thinking back, and I'm like, even when the podcast has a video, I don't watch it.
Yes, right?
You just put
Like
it right.
you might have your favorite YouTube show that you like to watch, but I imagine it's
Maybe.
probably not a podcast.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking of, like, if you listen to Joe Rogan, for example, they always have the videos of the
Yeah.
guests. But again, it's just you put it on and you're doing other stuff while you listen to it, like you said.
Totally,
Right?
totally. A lot of the feedback we get from the show is people reach out and they're like, "Oh, I love listening to you when we're on a car ride or when we're going to bed or when I'm doing housework," right? But the secret
Yeah.
is they love listening to me when they're doing something else. And an
Yeah.
audio podcast allows people to do that while a video does not.
But I think, like you said, it's again, you could not that I'm remotely putting anyone myself in this bracket, of course, but compare it on a micro scale to celebrity. People think they know them because they see them so much, and that's why. And I'm not saying that happens, but believe it or not, it's amazing. Even LinkedIn, right? Again, I'm not a celebrity by any means. Does my LinkedIn get around 1 million interactions a year so far? Yes, which is phenomenal.
Yeah.
But what I'm seeing at the minute is it precedes me often now.
Yeah.
Which it never did before. And I'm just talking in the last few
Yeah,
months. But the amount of people have been like, "Oh, Ross, I've seen you," and that's the value for
Yes.
me, because I'm telling a story and people I've never met are already briefed to a degree on the story.
That's right. There's interest before they've even met you. It's
Right.
almost
And so
it's like a warm up.
yes, no, absolutely it is. Yeah, a little warm. Yeah, 100%. So they're more familiar.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that adds, and in business, trust is the first thing you need to build. And if you lay the foundation for familiarity, you lay the foundation for trust. Now, it's not deceitful because it's just like, when I say my LinkedIn strategy, honestly, I get up in the morning and I'm an early riser and I'll have my coffee, and often I might have saved something to share, or I might not have anything to share, and I'll just think of something that's on my mind that specific day. There's no content calendar. There's no scheduled releases, if you will. It's all just how am I feeling on the day? And some days I'm more optimistic and happy than others, as all humans are.
Yeah.
And some days, like today, I just didn't, because I'd shared quite a bit this week and it got a lot of traction. And honestly, I was like, again, the ADHD piece, sometimes my brain just doesn't let me do things. Like someone will send me an email and I should respond to that. But it's like the brain just doesn't let you.
Yeah.
And so today was one of those on my LinkedIn posts.
Yeah,
So,
no, that happens to all of us. I totally get that. Yeah, there's just some days that are for responding and some that are just for tomorrow.
100%.
So, okay, so you were talking about. So, have you been with MBC Group since they were in the basement?
So I go back. So how MBC Group formed. So I started Pace in my basement, and he's still actually a shareholder of MBC, but Sanders was the first person to then join me. And so we essentially were providing building consulting services, project advisory services to insurers, in competition with the company I'd mentioned.
Yeah.
Now, we started doing well. We started to get business. Clients started to give us work. And I'd known there was a gentleman out east who a big insurer. Do you remember oh God, it would have been 2015. There was a big explosion in Canmore.
I don't remember that. When I think of like around that time, what I'm thinking of is that gigantic flood in Calgary.
Yeah, so it was just after those,
Okay.
and there was a gas line exploded and damaged lots of houses,
Wow.
and it was a big event. And I remember that a large insurer had flown this gentleman, Mark Beret, out from Quebec all the way to the Rockies to basically do what we could do. And I was like, why would they do that? That seems like a weird thing to spend. But again, so I then reached out because why not? I was curious who he was. Sure. And so when we met a couple of weeks after that, so I actually called a client who knew him to get his number. Again, proactivity. It didn't just happen. Yeah. And I went to meet him. I actually still remember this day by the airport. And I got there, and so he'd obviously done his research on me. And so he was on a big insurers list. Bearing in mind, he only had 6, I can't remember now, maybe 9 people in the East. So it wasn't a big company by any means at that point. And I essentially said, well, why don't we join forces? Come together because, you've got a big national contract with a big insurer. And I've got a very good relationships with adjusters across Alberta and BC, and we're picking up work. And so really that was the long and short of it, was should we do this? And we decided to, and then got off the ground. And so the first, what I love about this bit though is so I started in November. Like I'd started the business a bit before, I think around November we'd started. And so of course, weirdly, in the first half of 2016, the insurance industry was dead. As in there was just very few claims. Yeah. But it's cyclical, of course. I was going to
say, we were in the middle of a pretty big oil downturn at that point too.
Yeah, but usually it doesn't matter because the oil's downturn doesn't mean a condo doesn't flood, right? Sure. So yeah, there is obviously a correlation between economic growth and activity and claims, but it tends to be recession resistant, if you will. But anyway, whatever was going on, we had adjusted clients being like, we don't know what's happening here. And so I'm like, for the first 6 months, I'm like, what have I done here? Like, right? I'm like, is it me? Is this not going to work? But again, I missed that perseverance, right? And so I just kept pounding the pavement, doing what I did. Got a nice little lawsuit from my previous company, which incidentally just ended like a week ago.
Wow.
And they were wrong, but the only people that win are the lawyers. And it really, I look back now and I don't hold any grudges. It was corporate warfare. Yeah. Could he have made better choices and kept me? Yes. But I'm glad he didn't, because this wouldn't have happened, right? Yeah. So that's the way I always look at it. And so, 6 months of hard work, some work, but like this is not going how I anticipated. Sure. And then all of a sudden, Fort McMurray catches fire.
Yep.
And I'm looking at this and, again, it's tragic, but when you're in the business of responding to that and helping it. And so all that groundwork I'd put in with people started to come to fruition because they'd remembered me. And all of a sudden this big influx of work came in. And so from that, I think it was May it happened. And so from like May to July, I went from me to 10 people.
Wow.
And out west anyway. Yeah. And we responded to Fort Mac. This is where we I say burst onto the scene, because unlike our competitors who got a bigger majority of the work, admittedly, but they were the incumbent. But we were the new kids on the block, and there was really only one company that sort of had a monopoly-ish.
It sounds very specialized.
So it is, and it's under the radar. Everyone knows about the banking sector because you have Wolf of Wall Street and you have all these sexy movies about banking. Yeah. Tell me a sexy movie about insurance, right? Yeah. But I can tell you now that it is very much just as sexy as banking is when you get down to it. And so Fort Mac, so we actually got some really large ones, like the airport claim, for example. So our team was responsible for facilitating getting the airport up and operational as soon as possible, being critical infrastructure. And we actually got in there first because of that. And it was, yeah, it was an excellent experience. I was boots on the ground with the team, and it was sort of the first, and I still remember to this day. So we had work coming in, we had team members up there. I was sat in a Fort McMurray condo in the middle of town, still I had a little insurance adjusters book.
Yeah.
They don't issue them anymore, probably because people like me pestered everyone. Um, but I literally would get up in the morning and sit with my book, and I would email everyone in that
Yeah.
personally. And so again, I'm not saying there was strategy. It was just sales can be a numbers
Yes.
game,
Yeah.
and you got to reach out to 10 to get one.
Yeah. And
If you don't,
so, you hit on something that I talk about on the show all the time, because we live in a time where people want to sit back and they just want the phone to ring. But what they don't recognize is that we still require active marketing. You got to be proactive, not reactive. And if you're sitting around
correct.
waiting for someone to call you because you put out an ad, the problem is you got to get them on their worst day. They got to be actively looking for you. If you do what Ross is doing, he's getting ahead of them. He's introducing himself before there's a problem, so that when the problem happens, they already know who to call. It's Ross's brochure that's on the desk, right? Is that
Yeah, and you do both. You do it before, and then when it happens, you remind them you're
That's right,
there.
yeah.
Like
But you don't wait, right? And we live in a time where so
no,
many people want to sit and wait for their phone to ring, but it's just the wrong approach.
it is, and I go back to the amount of times sales opportunities have arisen through non-traditional sales opportunity avenues. I'm a big believer in pass it forward, and so I will always try and help people if I can. Like from I'll give you an example. I had a guy come around to knocked on my door, and he was like, "Oh, I'm here. Would you like your windows cleaned or booking?" And funnily enough, I was like, the wife had just been saying she wanted that done because we'd lived here 2 years, it hadn't been done. And I was like, I was like, "Lucky day, yes, I'll take it." And he was like, just giving us a sales pitch. I was like, "Stop, stop, stop!" And he got talking, and I asked about the business, of course, and he said, "Oh yeah, I started it like 6 months ago. This, that, and the other." I was like, "Oh, I didn't realize it was yours." I said you should have started with that because I still wanted
Yeah.
it, but you. And then, like I said, I was happy to help, and he ran us through what he was doing, and I was happy to make some introductions to some bigger companies that might utilize them. And again, there's no benefit, there's no like immediate benefit to me, nor should you expect
Yeah.
one. But again, I've become a bit of a hippie, thanks to my wife a little bit, in terms of call it karma, call it whatever you want, but I feel like you get what you put out.
Sure, I agree.
And if you're willing to help, I don't know. You never know. 5 years down the line, he might turn around, come back, and be like, "Oh, by the way, I remember you."
That's
And
right.
you just never
You don't.
know. And so that's how I always try to act, I
And
guess.
like being in oil and gas, like I've been in industrial oil and gas for a lot of years, and it's small. Like it looks like this gigantic industry, but really you end up dealing with the same people over and over and over again. Like industry is a lot smaller when you take it down to the individual connections. And yeah, 100%. You want to leave good vibes wherever you go, because they do come back around.
The biggest thing, honestly, what I've found interesting, and it's I guess the weirdest or hardest bit is, and I'm again, celebrities have it much worse, but you've found like there's an element, I don't know if it's jealousy, but I seem to have I've seemed to have created enemies in certain areas, and I don't truly believe warranted. Like I don't have any animosity towards them, but I feel as though there's been some disproportionate, like, I don't know if it's because of the public facing side of what I'm pushing, and I'm always sharing positivity, but it's definitely gone out of, like, you can't, people are odd like that. And so, I mean, because I'm the type of person, and again, back to an ADHD thing, the desire to be liked. Like I can live with not being liked, but my brain needs to know why.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like I'm okay if you don't like me, but what is it you don't like? And a lot of the times I find myself in this, feels like a bit of Narnia sometimes.
Yeah, no, you know what? That happens to everybody though, Ross. Like the reality is it's like you're a CEO. Right?
Yeah,
People are going to hate you just because you're a CEO. They don't have to lie.
Right, fair.
Right?
No, fair point.
Like, unfortunately, we live in a time where instead of pointing at themselves, which is where the finger needs to be pointing, like the reality is if you're unhappy with where you're at in your life, yeah, maybe some external circumstances got you there, but you can make choices that get you out. Only you. You know, if
Correct.
you're waiting for other people to make those choices for you, you're going to be waiting a long time. You know,
Yeah.
like you have to look at yourself if you want change in your life. And you know, the fact that
Mhm.
Ross is a CEO and he has pointed the finger at himself, took responsibility and did that for himself, right? And you can do
Yeah.
that too. But unfortunately, Ross, there's a lot of people that they don't know that or they don't see that, or it's easier to blame
Yeah.
other people than it is to make that change in their life, right? And
For
you
sure. I
can't
mean,
control
one of my YPO colleagues, friends, connections, I remember said to me, it was called the man. I think it's a, I don't know, poem or sonnet called "The Man in the Arena." And if you ever look it up, but essentially the story behind it is very much that it's easy to criticize and throw stones at the man in the arena, the one doing the fight. But if you're not in the arena, you don't get to say that really.
Yeah, yeah, it's really hard. Yeah, totally. It just comes down to accountability, right?
Of course,
The reality
absolutely.
is that there's a lot of people that for whatever reason in their life, they didn't learn accountability. And so it's
Yeah, no,
easier
agreed.
to blame other people when things aren't going right in their life than it is to look at the
For
choices
sure.
they've made to get there, right? And
For
I've made a
sure.
lot of shit choices. I will be the
Yeah, me as
first
well.
to
Yeah,
say I will be
absolutely.
the first to say I've made a lot of poor choices, but at one point in my life, I realized that I need to be accountable to myself and I turned it around. And, you
Yeah,
can too if that's you.
agreed. And like before, this is the beauty. This is the one thing that's why I try to be a little bit vulnerable, call it, on LinkedIn, because I'm very cognizant of, like, on Instagram, everyone's always just showing the best bits of life, and like whether you know that or not, it's just a false bar.
Yeah.
And so that's why I do like to share, like, whether it be struggles, whether it be, just like, because life is not perfect with roses all the time. And now, sure, you're going to go on LinkedIn and moan about your bad day. No, but like, I don't want people, you want people to understand the humanity side of it
Yeah.
all. That, like, my job is to be positive and glass half full.
Yes.
But just like every human, some days you're like, you just don't have the energy for that.
Yes.
So I like to share that though, because I want people to know that I'm not always like that.
Yes, yes. No, totally, totally. Like the reality is, if all you're looking at is LinkedIn and seeing the beautiful what I forget, I think I had a guest called Tash Jeffries and she's a rock star with like emotional intelligence. And I think she called it beautiful happy people syndrome or something like that is the
Yes,
LinkedIn
yes,
post, right? But it's so fake, right? And the reality is like that's not people's lives, but that's what you see, and so you start to believe that that's their life. But the reality is
right.
we all have struggles, we all have bad days, we all have days we don't want to get out of bed, and we all have rock star days, right? And it's just
Yeah,
you have to understand it's not what you're seeing online is not the full picture.
correct, correct, absolutely. I mean, it's like I always get comments on, traveling seems glamorous if you don't do it, but it's really
It's
not. Like,
toxic,
it becomes robotic. It becomes like going through the airport is
yeah,
systematic. It becomes part of your, like. And to be honest, in a weird way, the 4 hour flight to the Toronto has become like a little, like, I use it as like a little
yeah,
haven. Right, no one can call me. I've got 4 hours to
yeah,
myself,
yeah,
uninterrupted. Like, it's you don't get that anywhere
yeah.
else. So I don't know if that's sad or a tip, but
No, sounds like a great time to catch up on your favorite podcasts.
no, for sure. That's it. I'll be listening to this podcast moving
Yeah, there
forward
you
now, right?
go. Yeah, no, with one of my clients I work with, one of the executives there did 90,000 hours last year of flights. Or sorry, not
Oh,
90,000 hours, 90,000 kilometers. And I was like, "Oh
yeah,
my
wow.
gosh," like,
Yeah, I mean, I don't, because I'm trying to be Mr. Sustainable, but I was over 100,000 last year.
wow. Yeah, that like it sounds glamorous, but that's bloody exhausting.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's like that's like on average 2 flights a week.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Now, I'll admit that my travel hasn't been as much this summer because I've done a lot of Alberta
yeah,
focus, and with EcoClaim, a lot of it's been virtual because of the London connections and US. But I've quite enjoyed that, really. But it's allowed me to actually give more attention to Alberta, if you
yeah.
will, because you sometimes forget your home turf a little bit with all the travel.
Totally. So, okay, so I want to stick on I want to get into EcoClaim,
Yes, let's
but
get
let's
back.
get back to MBC Group quickly. So,
Yes.
you've had amazing growth. 7 locations in 7 years, right? Like that's crazy. Like what has it been like to be part of a company growing that but not just be part of it, to be head of a company growing at that rate? What has that been like for you?
a whirlwind. So yeah, you don't. The beauty of it for the first 5 years is I didn't have time to take stock and be aware of it. It was just
Yeah.
happening. And that's the only way I say just, I mean, there's a lot of work goes into that. So just happening is the wrong word in terms of the effort. But what I mean is you weren't really thinking, oh, this is a lot, this is happening. You're just so focused on achieving whatever target or goal it is that you've had to do at that specific
Yeah.
time. And so we essentially grew organically to around 50, 50 consultants in our sort of QS
Yep.
group. And, you know, at the start of the journey, I think I was driven by, and again, I was a driven person to begin with. But then when you get slapped with a lawsuit that is disingenuous, it sort of lit another fire.
Yeah.
And I used that as energy and sort of just went after their customers really. And it worked. I just made sure I provided brilliant
Yes.
service and client care. It sounds so simple, but the one thing service firms don't do very well often is
Yeah.
service. What a concept,
Yeah.
right? It's true. You know this, you're in business
Yes.
development.
Yes. Well, the relationship gets neglected is what it is. And
Correct. That's what I meant, client
yes,
service.
yes. And the main reason behind that is that most organizations are having their account managers do other jobs. Like they're doing multiple jobs within the organization right up to operations. And so when you have too many people wearing too many hats, something's got to give, and you don't want that something to be your account management.
Right, 100%.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry,
The
I interrupted you.
Oh, no, not at all. So yeah, we grew organically, and then I looked and the well, there's actually a funny story behind this one as well. How I'm not saying it's why it started, but it sort of gave me the push to go ahead. So we'd grown to around 50 people, and we had interest from a US firm that wanted to enter Canada. And I distinctly remember meeting with them. And Americans have a different style of business. Being British, you can see it. They're not, and again, they're a bit more brash than Canadians as a population, if you will. And so anyway, I met with these, and they essentially, I liked what they said. I understand that their business model was selling more services that customers needed, so more services to the same customers. But they were pretty brash. They essentially said if I didn't sell to them, they would buy a competitor and run me out of business. And so again, the competitive and protective side of me sort of came out, and I'd already thought about expanding. But I came out that meeting being like, okay, well, I've got about a year before they buy the competitor, which turned out to be almost 100%
Yeah.
on. And I left that meeting and identified several firms, people I'd worked with, a sort of older gentleman that didn't have exits, beginning with DF Technical, an environmental firm in Alberta. And I essentially decided I was going to introduce engineering and environmental services to our insurance clients because those are used regularly. And I'd worked on enough losses where we were managing those professionals. And I thought to myself, well, I'm managing them. So why not bring them under our banner and try and provide a better service with more accountability? And so that's really, it sounds, what's funny is it doesn't sound innovative, but it was at the time in insurance. Like there was firms somewhat doing it, but I think I was one of the first in Canada to bring that together. And so I went out my way, and over from 2018 till 2022, we acquired 5 different companies.
Wow.
Across Canada. So we ended up with offices in Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Regina, Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa, and then we have satellites in the Atlantic region.
Yeah. Wow. It's so funny because, when I asked you, what is it like to be part of that? And you say, a whirlwind. I remember having a conversation with another guest, and same thing that, he was running $1 billion mortgage firm, and it became $1 billion mortgage firm in just a number of years, like 5 years type thing.
Yeah.
And I remember asking him like, what was that like? How do you even keep up? He's like, just one step at a time. It feels like unbelievable when you're in it. I imagine this is about the same.
Yeah. It's like false peaks. Like I said, there's no, and I think that's actually inherent. I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs and what have you, and I think it's a good and a bad thing. So it provides the drive, but and maybe take it with a pinch of salt, the word, but there's lack of satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, you've got this, like,
It's happening so quickly, you don't even have the ability to appreciate it.
no, no, no. It's more like what keeps Elon Musk going? Why would Elon Musk try and go to Mars, try and create a company that goes underground to solve traffic problems, create the world's largest electric vehicle company? Like, the list goes on. He doesn't need to do any of those. He's the richest man in the
Yeah.
world, but it's got nothing to do with monetary drive. It's like there's just something that does it. Like, there's something you have to do. There needs to be more. You need to build something
It's
more,
intrinsic.
and there's no rationale behind it. And that's what drives me. That's why we've launched EcoClaim, because we're building it's an offshoot of MBC, and I'm invigorated by the building component of it. And so that's really what becomes the drive. But it's also a bit of a sickness because, like you said, I'm only 35 and we've built a company in 7 years of this size. And like, but whoop-de-doo.
Yeah. Well, what's next?
Right? That's what I mean. But that's the sickness. Like, I am so appreciative.
I have the same sickness. I totally get it. I totally get it. Yeah. And I think once you've built one and you built one successfully, you look at it as like, well, I could do this again, or I could do something different.
Right.
And you're right.
Yeah.
It does become about just something that you feel like you need to do. And I think too, once you've hit you talked about Elon Musk, once you have a certain level of success, it doesn't make sense to quit. Like, just internally, you're
Right.
not like quitting. Like, even if you just stopped and you're like, yeah, I've made $250 billion or whatever, right? But then it's like, well, what am I going to do with my time?
Bingo. Purpose.
You need purpose.
Yeah, and that's what really it boils down to, I think. So whilst I say unsatisfied, it's getting up in the morning and having a purpose.
Totally.
And if that purpose can make the world a better place, even in a microcosm of 150 people, but that to me is worthwhile.
Yes.
And so, that's why we do what we do. And so we grew. I mean, again, that's the shorter version, but essentially integrated those companies. There was no external investment. This was done through having an excellent executive team to help me navigate it. Again, bringing in experienced people in, our chairman and COO, gentlemen that have been in the executive hot seat longer than I've been alive.
Mm-hmm.
So whilst I've got the, for lack of a better term, the piss and vinegar and drive that you need, 5 years ago, I was very rough around the edges, shall we say. And I'd say thanks to ensuring good mentorship, I think those edges have slowly, and maybe they not quite agree with this when they listen to it, but I like to think some of those edges have been worn down a little bit now.
Yes. I've had some
polished.
I've had some great mentors in my life too, and I totally get that, right? It's like you need someone to level you out a little bit.
Yeah. Well, you do, absolutely. And I've been so appreciative. And again, I look back when so our chairman was my original business partner's brother. I acquired the shares of my business partner a few years ago. So, but our chairman stayed on. Now, he'd been an executive with some very large companies and had been around the block, and really, I think, saw something in me and wanted to help support me do this. So I owe him a lot of credit for that. But I look back at some of the first board meetings we had versus the board meetings that we have now, and I asked myself, how the hell did he sit through those meetings? Because I don't think even now in my capacity, I could have sat and had a productive board meeting with the me of 7 years ago, never mind my business partner.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. So when you appreciate someone who has always been at this level when it started, bringing you with them, or like helping you get to sort of the same understanding as them. And it's that mentorship, the patience required of it.
Yes. And you know what though, but you're conscious of it.
Now we look hindsight, right?
Well, I know, but like the reality is the job has been done because you were aware. You're very aware of who you were then versus who you are now, what those changes are, and what the effective efficiency increases have been, right? So,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I'd say he did his job well.
No, he's still with us, so it's
and you're open, right? There's a lot of founders and presidents and stuff who are very closed-minded, right? I know the right way of doing this. I've recognized very early on I know nothing. I look at it as I was an expert until yesterday, right? I'm an expert in business development until yesterday. The reality is if I stop learning today, I'm going to be screwed tomorrow. So I
Yeah.
always go into everything thinking like, yeah, I have a good idea, but there's always more to learn. And that doesn't matter whether that's in like client facing stuff or whether that's running my own organization or whether that's just me as a parent. Like I
Yes. Yeah.
recognize that I know a lot, but I have to always keep learning or I'm going to end up behind.
Correct. And that's it's always questions and asking. I do lots of that because I genuinely want to understand. Like, again, what I'm very thankful of through the YPO, through MBC's customers and the Business Council of Alberta, I say access, but I do access and exposure to these individuals that have achieved far more than I have, even at similar ages. And so, again, not that you're judging per se, but learning from them and hearing what they've done. And like, that's because it goes back to what you said, all the challenges. So I don't think I can say the name, but anyway, they're an institutional house builder in Alberta. Sure. And I met with one of the current president, who I guess it goes back generations. Yeah. And he was telling us the story of what happened in the 70s and 80s with the recession and what have you, and bank load and debt loads and the stories he was telling. It was like just repeating what I was going through. And I'm thinking to myself, so it didn't matter, 50 years ago, businesses had the same challenges and people had to overcome the same adversity in business to be successful. So whilst the playing fields changed, generally the rules haven't.
Yeah.
And so that again, but it gives you a little bit of, I'm not sure if hope's the right word, but when you've got business problems and sometimes things can seem overwhelming or insurmountable. And then when you hear people haven't gone through those challenges for longer periods of time, because you just see them now as the successful person they are. You don't see the trials and tribulations they had to go through. So when you hear it, it just gives you that extra humanity side.
That's right. Yeah, no, totally. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that a lot of the problems we're facing are problems that most business owners have faced throughout time, right? Like,
yeah, 100%,
right? Like for the most part, yeah, while the service offerings have changed, while the people, are a little different, the reality is we're all overcoming the same problems to keep operations moving forward.
But the difference is a lot of businesses, and it depends, again, if you meet someone and you say, how's business? Oh yeah, it's good, standard answer. And it's like, when you have a connection or you have a level of trust, people will tell you what's really going on. And because like whenever anyone tells me business is good, I mean, you're lying, because there's always like, business is literally solving problems. As an executive, your job is not to blame. It's situations arise and your first question is, what are we doing to solve this?
Yeah.
And the best people are the ones that learn to solve those.
Yes. No, absolutely. Right? Well, it just goes right back to the accountability thing, right?
Which takes us, I mean, the solving piece is really where I've always been one to, my chairman says I like to build mouse traps and sell them. So it just depends what type of mice you're trying to catch, but I'll build one. Yeah. And so in 2000, again, I go back to the chain link connection thing here. So I submitted to speak at the 2020 AGM for the CIQS, the Canadian Institute of Quantity Surveyors. And so I wanted to do a unique topic. And so I didn't really know, I knew about sustainability. It was, university. I understood all the terminology, but didn't really understand it in practice. Sure. And so I decided to propose a seminar on sustainability within insurance, because insurance restoration in Canada is a $15 billion market in just restoration work. Yeah. And the insurance companies play a huge part in our lives. It's one of the only industries, like everything, if you look around, everything in your room there, in your home office is insured. Yes. So insurance literally touches everything and people forget this.
Yeah, it's true.
Right? Yeah. And so I decided to give it on that because it was a bit unique, different perspective. But of course, me being me, I didn't want to waste an opportunity to, can make a connection with a client. Sure. And so one of our biggest customers at the time, Aviva, had publicly announced, both out of London, that they had ambitions to be net zero by 2050. But as with all the ambitions that get announced by executives, that executive is not going to be there in 2050 when it has to come to pass.
No.
And so, but don't get me wrong, it's meaningful change, good for them for being the instigators, because the top of the food chain have to care about sustainability and climate change and reducing our carbon footprint, because if they don't, none of the below will.
Yeah.
And so they'd announced this net zero by 2050. And so I saw that and I said, well, I'm giving a seminar on this exact topic to a group of construction professionals. So there's a reason for Aviva to be interested in presenting. So me being me again, little old Ross reached out to the CEO of Aviva. I knew he was British, so I leveraged that a little bit.
Yeah.
And to his credit, he got back to me. But again, often people just won't make that jump because, and I'm sure they get lots of useless stuff. So you've got to try and be a little bit unique and short with your approach, make it valuable, right? The amount of LinkedIn reach outs I get that are like, well, I said that to you when you reached out, because my usual is they say, oh, can we speak with you? And then it's, by the way, it's $2,000 to come on. And I'm like,
yeah, I don't understand that side of it, to be honest. You know, the reality is it's like, you know, I'm happy that you have come on my show. Why in the world would I charge you for it? I don't.
Well, that's, agreed. And I'm happy to come on because it's a good forum for, to speak and tell stories.
Absolutely. Right. You know, the reality is there's benefit to both of us from this show. Like, I don't see why there has to be a charge for it too.
No, agreed. And so I invited them on. Now he couldn't make it. So he actually sent his senior vice president along, who again happened to be another Brit. Yeah. And so we got connected, started chatting. He presented for 5 minutes during that on what they were doing. And I didn't think anything of it. And so a few months passed. And then all of a sudden I got an invite from procurement to be involved in. Essentially, they were looking to benchmark their supply chains carbon emissions, because that was step one. And we were the only service firm invited to that. But that was because of me having invited Paul, the SVP at the time, onto this call. So if I hadn't done that, again, the sequence and hindsight
there
piece,
wouldn't have been the connection,
right? And so and I'm on this call, and most of it's contractors, right? And a lot of restoration is quite fragmented. So there's some large companies, but then there's a lot of smaller ones. And again, it's no secret that the sophistication level with construction, there's definitely a curve. The bigger you are, the more sophisticated you have to be, as with any business. Yeah. And so a lot of these contractors, and some of them have said this to me, so it's not me being derogatory by any means, but they'd said that they could barely spell ESG, right? Never mind provide data to an insurance company on what it is.
Sure.
And so I'm on this call, and I'm just, my light bulb was just going off. Because quantity surveyor is one of the things we can do, and there's international measurement standards for it, is quantify carbon.
Okay.
In construction. Yeah. So the embodied carbon of a project, the carbon release of a project, the carbon footprint. So there's international standards. So we do that as a service. And so I'm on this call and I said to myself, well, we've done sustainability consulting on a government project, very expensive, much larger, but the government were I looked at it and I said, well, we appraise your claim. So we go and we say, this is damaged. Here's the market value. We're quantifying the damage and the cost. Yeah. So I emailed the executive saying, well, we've done this before. And I've got a system here. We could just essentially quantify the carbon footprint of your claims, your scope. Their scope 3, if you understand greenhouse gas emissions and how that's tracked. And they loved it. And so I said, well, we as a service, we'll do our regular work, but we'll also do this. Yeah. And so that's the short one. And then the BC floods happened. You may remember, I think it was December 2021. The Vancouver had the 1 in 500 year flood. Yeah. Not every 1 in 500 years now, as you see on the news regularly, but that's what they called it. And we got a call from the executive, and they were like, well, there's no better time to do it than now. Because their exact words were, and I'll always remember, I think it's very brave for an executive at $1 billion company to do this. But he said that there's a tendency in big corporations, we'll talk about it, and everyone's afraid to do any action because of potential consequences. Yeah. And he's like, if we don't do it now, we're never going to do it. And so he pulled the trigger. And so before you knew it, EcoClaim was born. Yeah. And we did a pilot. And it was hugely successful, even with all the challenges. Like the recycling facility in Vancouver shut down. So how are we going to mitigate waste when there's nowhere to send it? So we worked out, that all worked out. And I think we had like a 69% of the waste on 100 claims avoided landfill. Now, the average recycling of a construction project or renovation demolition in Canada is 16%.
I believe it. Yeah.
But that's atrocious because it's just laziness.
Yeah.
And so, but what I learned through that process was, whilst it was successful, insurance companies didn't really want another expense on a claim. They already pay for engineers. They already pay for forensic accountants. They already pay for adjusters. They didn't want to have to pay for another sustainability service, irrespective of, especially because it wasn't regulated yet. Sure. It's about to be, thankfully, but not then it wasn't.
Yeah.
And so I sat back. And so whilst the pilot was a success, it just didn't stick as well as I was hoping it would. And so I sat back and I said to myself, well, how do we bring this to market and solve these problems? How do we solve the problem for the insurers of the so what? Like, why should they care? And we also need to make sure it doesn't cost more in terms of the actual work, but also in terms of the services on it. And so we created a training certification body that will train restoration contractors. We've just aimed this at restoration for now because it's our core market. Yeah. Essentially train them on our EcoClaim process, which minimizes what they have to do because we understand construction and restoration. So we've structured it in such a way that it's minimal extra effort, doesn't cost more, and we've proven this time and time again, and is independently verified by a third-party waste collector. So they essentially put the waste into certain bins. That they're trained through all this. This is waste management. There's lots of modules to it, so I'm oversimplifying, but in essence. Sure. And essentially that data is then fed into a software that we've developed, EcoTracks as it's called. And so we've essentially created a full dashboard that tracks all the waste on a specific project. Insurers can see it by region, by contractor, by branch. And because the process is going through ISO certification, we ultimately are looking all the carbon reduced or avoided. We are looking to capture voluntary credits as a result of those activities.
Okay. So
not only do we have a training certification group, because you have to have that for the supply chain, because in order for insurers to track their supply chain, the supply chain has to be actively involved. And so we've created that, a dashboard that they can essentially see all the data in one place. We've introduced AI into that so we can see, so it can analyze trends, analyze infrastructure in the region, and determine what's sufficient and what isn't. And then the carbon exchange for us, not only do we get to track and inventorize what they're doing, but we can then essentially monetize the efforts down the line.
Yeah. Is there like, with the carbon credits that you guys are like able to identify, then does that equal cash back for your customers essentially?
Yeah, so the voluntary carbon markets, like last year in North America, around 2.5 billion voluntary credits were exchanged. Now we have something called compliant credits. Compliant credits are essentially government certified processes, and those are worth real tax credits. Voluntary carbon credits are essentially companies have captured it under, there's lots of different standards, and that's the problem. So there's a few reputable companies like ISO and Gold Standard that are generally good, but of course there's hundreds of others that, so the issue with them becomes is it greenwashed? How do you support that the voluntary carbon credit is real? And the value of them is largely based on the story behind them as well.
Yeah.
And so that piece is in its infancy because we've got it off the ground, but we have to do the training and roll out the software. And we've just launched with Gore Mutual, a national insurer in Canada. They're the first launch partner, and we have several others in the works. And so we're really creating a bit of a wave here. And the government have come out and said by 2025, financial institutions, banks, and insurers have to report their scope 3 emissions, which is their supply chain and claims.
Gotcha.
So we started out doing this because our customers said they wanted it.
But it's going to become.
And now legislative change is 2-3 years away, which I mean, it's excellent for us because now whether you want it or not, do it or not, the government are saying you're going to have to. So our product's a bit, you're going to need it, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. No, it's very forward thinking.
And that was just serendipitous, like I said. But the insurance industry as a whole, I've got to say, I've talked to lots of insurers, and the insurance industry really is getting ahead of sustainability and doing what they can. And quite rightly, though, because they respond to the events behind it. So when there's increased fires everywhere, increased floods due to climate change, they're paying the bill. So they'd be silly not to be at the forefront of trying to prevent it getting worse.
True. Yeah. I was going to say, I don't think they make a whole lot of money when an entire city burns down.
No, not at all. Well, and the consumer pays because rates go up. Their businesses,
they all
right?
lose.
Yeah. And so for us, that's the next big one, is essentially scaling a software training and carbon exchange. And that's what's in the horizon here. So
that's amazing, dude. Yeah, that's really cool. That's really cool. I'm excited to see kind of what's coming next from you guys. Yeah, absolutely. So if someone wanted to get a hold of you, they want to engage your services, who are your target clients? And then how would they reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so 60% of our business ties to insurance companies. So we respond to loss events. And so it's quite a niche market with a niche customer base. So, I mean, they know how to contact us through our website. But of course, our other 40% of our business is we work for developers, providing civil engineering. We work for large institutions, everything from oil and gas to cement, designing industrial facilities. I always like to use this one. So you may know the cement factory in Canmore as you drive out. Well, we acquired a company called Strudez Engineering just over a year and a half ago. And so that is one of their designs. They did that. So I wasn't born when that was designed, but that is one of our projects. And so essentially everything from your bog standard condo buildings all the way up to large industrial facilities.
Very cool. And so any type of engineering and design you guys can basically handle.
Correct. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, man, this has been a heck of an interview. Really appreciate it, Ross. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well.
Yeah, this has been.
And I'll make sure you're my first guest on my new podcast when it gets released. So.
I would be honored to be on your podcast, and I would love to chat business development with you on it. I think
absolutely. That's what I want to talk about now.
Absolutely. This has been episode 52 of the Business Development Podcast. We've been graced today by Ross, the president, CEO of MBC Group. It's been absolutely amazing to have you, Ross. Thanks so much for coming on. And until next time, we will catch you on the flip side.
This has been the Business Development Podcast with Kelly Kennedy. Kelly has 15 years in sales and business development experience within the Alberta oil and gas industry and founded his own business development firm in 2020. His passion and his specialization is in customer relationship generation and business development. The show is brought to you by Capital Business Development, your business development specialists. For more, we invite you to the website at www.capitalbd.ca. See you next time on the Business Development Podcast.